Thank you for joining us for today's Crosspoint Devotion. Today I want to go to the book of Joshua. I've been reading through this book in my daily Bible readings, and I ran across a passage that I found very interesting because it has to do with misunderstandings. Have you ever been a part of a misunderstanding in your life? My guess is that you have, and it probably happened this week. There might have been a misunderstanding between you and your children. There could have been a misunderstanding between you and your spouse. You might have even had a misunderstanding with someone at work. I find that all the time in our lives, because we've got multiple people that we're interacting with, there's always the potential for misunderstandings because some of us are just not real good at communicating. And so we create communication problems that lead to misunderstandings, and then we end up in a fight. And do you know that that's a problem that has been a part of our culture as humanity since the beginning? Because when sin came into the world, it created all kind of confusion, including misunderstandings between people. And in Joshua chapter 22, we've got a prime example of a misunderstanding. Now let me try to set the stage as best I can historically, because you got to understand the backstory in order to really understand the full implications of the misunderstanding. But let's start with the 12 tribes of Israel. Moses had finally led them after 40 years to the edge of the promised land, and as they approached going across the Jordan River, 2.5 of the 12 tribes came to Moses and they said, "Would you look at this land on the east side of the Jordan? It's flat, it's spacious, it's got great grass in all directions, and our 2.5 tribes have a lot of flocks and herds, and this would be an ideal place for our flocks and herds to spread out and for us to live in the future. Would you let us consider staying on the east side of the Jordan instead of going into the promised land so that our herds and flocks will have a place to graze and to pasture?" Moses granted their request with one concession. He said, "What I need you to do before you settle here is to go ahead and cross the Jordan River with your brothers, the 9.5 tribes, and I want you to do battle with them in conquering the promised land. But once it's settled and it's conquered, you'll be free to come back to the eastern side of the Jordan and settle with your flocks and herds." The 2.5 tribes agreed to this request, and they crossed over with the other 9.5 tribes and the 12 tribes together. Over a period of time under the leadership of Joshua, they conquered the land, they settled the land, and everything was in order when the 2.5 tribes decided to return home on the eastern side of the Jordan. But before they crossed over, when they were still on the western edge of the Jordan River, the 2.5 tribes built an altar. The problem was that those 9.5 tribes didn't know why the altar was built. The 2.5 tribes did not communicate very well their intentions for the altar that they were building. So the 9.5 tribes assumed, because they didn't know, that the 2.5 tribes were building an altar to a false god, and they were going to worship idols there. So the 9.5 got their army together to go down and confront the 2.5 with the intention of slaughtering them, because they knew God would not accept false idol worship in the promised land. Well, when the 9.5 tribes got there and they confronted these 2.5 tribes, this is what the 2.5 tribes said. "We actually did this for a specific concern that in the future your descendants might say to our descendants, 'What relationship do you have with the Lord, the God of Israel? For the Lord has made the Jordan a border between us and your descendants of Reuben and Gad. You have no share in the Lord. So your descendants may cause our descendants to stop fearing the Lord. Therefore we said, let's take action and build an altar for ourselves, but not for a burnt offering or a sacrifice. Instead, it is to be a witness between us and you and between the generations after us, so that we may carry out the worship of the Lord in His presence with our burnt offerings, sacrifices, and fellowship offerings. And then in the future, your descendants will not be able to say to our descendants, 'You have no share in the Lord.'" This was over a simple misunderstanding. The 2.5 tribes were looking down the road into the future and realized, your descendants may say to our descendants, "You don't belong to Israel, and you can't come worship the Lord." And we want our descendants to have a way to say, "Oh, yes, we do. We built this altar to remind you we belong to you and we belong to the Lord, and we are all together as Israel. A simple misunderstanding occurred because there was not good communication. Let me encourage you today, if you've got a misunderstanding going with someone, then maybe you need to go and just have a simple conversation and clarify the facts, bring forth the motives and the intentions, and clarify the problem so that you can get back together and both serve the Lord together. I hope this will encourage you as you work toward overcoming your misunderstandings, because we want God's people to be unified so that the gospel can go forth and Jesus can be exalted. I hope you have a great day.